So the first panel is a toxic stew, human waste, and warming water. And again, this is hearing from different communities dealing with septic contamination issues, from Cape Cod waterways in Massachusetts to the Upper Missouri in Montana and the Gallatin River, as well as national septic issues. So we have Guy Elsensor, if you want to come up, Guy. And Guy is the executive director of the Upper Missouri Waterkeeper in Montana. We have Ashley Fisher, the director of natural resources, the town of Mashpee in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And then we have Brett Walton, the environmental journalist at Circle of Blue, Where Water Speaks. Thank you, everyone. And part of this, we do want to make this a little bit informal as well. Obviously, we don't want you to start heckling everybody, but so at the end, again, we're going to have enough time to have questions as well. So I'm going to ask each of them just to kind of go through, for about 5 minutes, each of them, just to talk about, what are the issues that they're dealing with, what are the water quality issues that they're dealing with in their areas.
Great. So don't hate me for staring at my small phone with my increasingly bad eyes, but I jotted down my shorthand notes here. The life of a environmental attorney staring at a screen is starting to really get me. So long story short, my name is Guy. I work for Upper Missouri Waterkeeper. I'm also a public interest environmental attorney. I practice throughout the Northern Rockies. I founded Upper Missouri Waterkeeper, which is a strikingly similar water quality, water quantity protection organization. We're based out of Bozeman. We similarly work throughout the 3,500 square miles of southwest Montana's Upper Missouri River Basin. And I like to say I'm a recovering attorney, which really means I approach most of my work through this idea of what is our strategic ability to get near-term results. And when I think about what are the biggest water quality challenges and some background that would be applicable to you, I immediately think about the resort community of Big Sky, Montana, and the water quality challenges on the Gallatin River. And the short synopsis there is you have unfettered growth, you have a complete lack of meaningful zoning, we have a complete corporate captured regulatory agency that's asleep at the switch, and you have very much so pressing nitrate levels in your cobble bed alluvial floodplains. You have widespread historic septic systems, and then you have an enormous multi-billion-dollar resort complex that is chugging forward at a growth rate that is prodigious, to say the least. We're talking about $800 million has been invested by Cross Harbor and Big Sky Resort, Boyne, in the last 10 years, and they're on track to double their existing footprint. All the while, you have the main stem Gallatin River, which flows directly out of Yellowstone National Park, and when it meets that community, the first thing it does is go neon green, and so we're dealing with this very real issue of how do you hold accountable a massive proliferation of a resort community that's based upon, ideally, this clean and healthful environment, and yet you have the main source of its wealth, the golden goose as it were, going green. And the number one challenge that we're approaching at my organization is using targeted citizen action, scientific baselines, and impact litigation to hold accountable key sectors of that community, which is to say, we don't even have city fathers in the community of Big Sky. It's not an incorporated facility, which lends itself to a whole nother stew of problems. But for us, that means if we know that our blue ribbon trout streams are suffering and literally having deoxygenated zones, cyanobacteria blooms, people can't let their dogs or their kids go jumping off a bridge on a hot day, where does that really leave us? And my organization's approach is to identify the leading sectors, to focus on both federal and state enforcement actions in terms of bringing those particular larger community-based or institutional systems under the ambit of either federal pollution control laws or state pollution control laws through targeted impact litigation, through scientific baselines, where here again, much like POW-JH, nobody had done the work. And so I hear and see no evil because we have not done the research. Very easy to ignore what you don't know, and also very hard to manage what you don't know. So we focus very much so on this idea of develop the science, qualify and quantify the problem, figure out whether state, local, or federal law applies in terms of being able to offer you a roadmap for both certainty in terms of controlling those discrete sources of pollution, prioritize those sources of pollution, and then play the Teddy Roosevelt game of there is a carrot and there is a stick. And in our opportunity that I hope to discuss more with you today, it's been an opportunity to stop that resort community from putting direct discharge pipes into the river. We forced them to do a $60 million membrane bioreactor facility upgrade, which is a great first step, but it also does not solve the problem. It's not a silver bullet. We're also focused now on essentially stopping all the commercial scale development right next to the Gallatin River, which has largely been a game of playing whack-a-mole at the county fair with pollution permits under state law. That said, we're winning. And we are tangibly reducing existing nutrient inputs. So what I can offer you is perspective on how can you harness innovative, creative, legal, and administrative advocacy strategies to empower your local county officials as well as your state officials to either do their job or to be held accountable to do their job. And that's really where a lot of our focus in the Gallatin has been. And I'm pleased to say, while we haven't solved the problem yet, we are certainly making headway and tangibly reducing a very well-documented problem with septic, wastewater, and anthropogenic-based water pollution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. So I'm Ashley Fisher. I'm the Director of Natural Resources for the town of Mashpee. I have a background in aquaculture and more marine biology. So I grew shellfish, and I worked on a salmon hatchery in school. So I had to shift my thoughts when I got into the field of being a Director of Natural Resources for the town of Mashpee on Cape Cod to water quality. I started working first at the Department of Natural Resources as a intern through Barnstable County in the Department of Health, and we were really looking at water quality. So I just wanted to give you some history of the Cape. So I'm sure you all know of the Patti Page song from the 1960s, Old Cape Cod. That really started the building boom. People were coming from all over the country to build their homes on Cape Cod. It is a tourist community. We see roughly 7 million visitors each year, and we only have a full-time residency of about 250,000. So in the 1980s, which is really when we saw the building boom, there was what we call pop-up neighborhoods sprawling across Cape Cod in every community. So much so that the region saw the issue of water quality starting right away on our coastal areas and our estuaries. We started to see eelgrass, which is an indicator species in our area, die off. Which in turn affected the scallop populations, which is a huge commercial fishing industry on the Cape. We now have little to no sea scallops or bay scallops in our area because of water quality. So the building boom, primarily these buildings that were set up were on-site septic systems. And those septic systems were leaching about 80% of all of the nitrogen we were seeing into our estuaries. The on-site septic systems were a bad idea for the area. Our indigenous community of the Mashpee Wampanoag recognized the problem in the 70s and 80s and went to our regional planning office, the Cape Cod Commission, and said, you're gonna have an issue. This was in the 70s. So we knew we were gonna have a problem. We started seeing decline in water quality. We started seeing cyanobacteria blooms. We started seeing algal mats floating on our rivers and our estuaries. And the ball was continually kicked down the field, swept under the rug. We needed to grow. We needed to get bigger. We needed an economy, more visitors, more second homeowners, more. Now we're at the point of we need to do something. It's very visual. Our citizens are seeing the green cyanobacteria, so much so that it's so thick, it's pea soup. Some of our ponds you cannot see. Transparency of our water column, you can't see more than a meter. If you put your hand in the water, you're not going to see your hand. That's where we are on the Cape in Mashpee. When we have our DPH thresholds of cyanobacteria, which is 70,000 cells per milliliter, and you're exceeding 500,000 cells per milliliter, you have a problem. It's time to act. And the problem for the Cape is, for regional planning, we had to take the scientific data, the political action, which was grow, and try to change that, along with how are we going to finance this? How are we going to get the money to do a $1 billion infrastructure project across the Cape? We're in that now. So our 208 plan was created by our regional planning Cape Cod Commission, and each community had to go through a watershed plan, looking at what do we do, what do we strategize, what areas do we sewer to get to our total maximum daily load for nitrogen. So that happened. The communities got their comprehensive plan in roughly 2013, 2015. They sat on a shelf for about 5 years. Yes. Kicked under the rug, pushed the ball down the road. It became more visual. Species diversity is gone in our estuaries. We're seeing mud snails or single species, jellyfish in our estuaries, fish kills. So we did see massive fish kills in mats come to the shoreline, low to no oxygen at night. So even striped bass and some of the fisheries are dying. We have what's called the blob in Cape Cod Bay, which is no oxygen at all, no lobster fishery. This is worst case scenario, and now we're in the process of laying pipe and getting our septic treatment facilities done. So I'm here today to really just explain to you what you can do financially, and really just give you a view into your future if you don't do something now, if you don't act. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out this morning. I don't know if Megan is aware of this, but in a little happy coincidence, this week, as designated by the EPA, is Septic Smart Week. So nice that we are talking about these issues
Yes.
during the PSA
Nailed
week
it.
for septic. I'm Brett Walton. I'm a reporter for Circle of Blue. We're a nonprofit news agency that reports on water issues nationally and internationally. And I'm here to provide some big picture context on septic systems across the country and some of the issues and problems that I have seen. 8 years ago, I did a 5-part series on septic system pollution in the US. And like a lot of people, septic systems, for me, having grown up on city water, was the ultimate out of sight, out of mind issue. They're buried, you don't see them, you put them in, and many people forget about them and would just rather not think about it. And that's causing problems in a lot of places across the country. About 1/5 of households in the US are on a septic system. And septic system installations are still growing, not so much in this region, Intermountain West. A lot of the new septic system installations are happening in New England and the South, where in New England, it's about half of homes, even today, are in septic systems. And like climate change is an analogy I make in some of the stories, no single car is responsible for the warming of the planet. No single septic system is responsible for water quality problems. But you combine a lot of cars, you combine a lot of septic systems in a small area, and suddenly you have a problem. And those problems are cropping up, in many places across the country, beyond Cape Cod and beyond Jackson Hole. In my series, I looked at Long Island, where a lot of the similar coastal estuary issues that Ashley brought up are occurring there. Eelgrass die-offs, clear water that's no longer clear, fish kills. Long Island, as I found out, has one of the highest densities of septic systems in the country. About 1 million people in Suffolk County and Nassau County are on septic systems. And if you look at Long Island, that's a lot of people on septic for not a very big place. So as you get higher and higher densities, then the problems start to crop up. And those problems are environmental problems, and they are human health problems. One of the big issues is nitrate. We have a federal drinking water standard of 10 parts per million for nitrate, and that standard was set based on blue baby syndrome. So impacts to infants. Infants were dying in rural areas from drinking well water that had high concentrations of nitrate. So we had that 10 parts per million standard, but what we're finding now is that perhaps 10 parts per million, while protective of blue baby syndrome, is not protective against other health problems, chronic exposure health problems, and newborn health problems. So there are studies coming out from the US and Denmark that look at associations and are finding associations with nitrate in that 3 to 10 parts per million, associated with low infant birth weight, preterm birth, some birth defects, and then in adults, over long chronic exposures of decades, associations with colorectal cancer and thyroid illness. So EPA is, I did a long series 2 years ago on nitrate and these other health problems. The changing of the federal health standard is highly unlikely right now because that would cause huge problems, huge costs across the country for utilities. But it is something that people should be aware of, especially in rural areas that have water from a well, that are near septic systems and have increasing concentrations of nitrate. So it's not only nitrate, it's also E. coli. There's a really eye-catching example that I used to start off the series from Wisconsin, where there was a restaurant that opened there in 2007 called the Log Den. The restaurant, 3 weeks after opening, suddenly had to close because more than 200 people got sick, patrons of the restaurant, plus employees, got sick with norovirus. And how did this happen? They have a well field and a septic field. And the two were, one was draining into the other. There was a cracked fitting on their septic tank, and their well was downstream of the septic tank. They were, in effect, poisoning their well with their septic tank because of the leak. And all that water from the well was used in ice making and washing lettuce, et cetera. 3 weeks after opening, you had hundreds of people get sick. And when I talked to the owner, almost 10 years later, he still had to answer questions about, is your water safe, because people had associated this restaurant with the norovirus outbreak. So these things can persist, and they get worse the longer you let them fester. So that's, action needs to take place, and I guess that's why we're here today.
Thank you. I would add that Brett is pretty humble as the award-winning series that he did on national septic issues, so good to know. So another thing is, so protect your water, some of you know this, some of you don't, but we raised $250,000 and we pressured the county into doing a water quality master plan. And so for the past year and a half, we've been working with Teton County, the town of Jackson, and Teton Conservation District on this. And Brad had mentioned this, but it's an important piece that we are now at the point where we are waiting for recommendations from Tri-Hydro, the consulting company who is making the recommendations. And we're at a great place. So I wanted to ask this crew, what would you make recommendations for us based on next steps from having this water quality master plan that will not sit on the shelf?
All right, that's a complicated question, but the good news is there's also some straightforward answers. Any type of a water resources management plan really needs to be focused upon two particular elements. Number one, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish, right? And if you think about the scientific method, that's where my master's degree focus is, this idea of integrated water resources planning. In our case, in your case, you should be really focused on having site-specific criteria. You need to understand what is the qualitative state that you need for your drinking water supply, for your sole source aquifer, and then you also need to understand, obviously, the hydrogeology and the connectivity between your groundwater and your surface water resources, the trigger points for degradation, harm, both to you as a human as well as to the wildlife, your economy, et cetera. For surface water, water quality is going to be far more stringent. So all this to say, your number one goal, in my opinion, ought to be setting defensible, science-based standards for what is acceptable water quality for both your groundwater throughout the valley as well as your respective surface water. Once you have those standards, you need to come up with an accountability framework. And the way you do that is ideally federal law, state law, and your county zoning. That you need to either identify what the low-hanging fruit are in terms of where we know there are existing problems that are not complying and or violating those criteria that you've helped develop. And secondly, once you've identified the biggest bang for your buck solutions, you need to systematically go after those largest sectors. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that we are in a world where we have finite human capital, finite economic capital, and finite political will. I would offer that my experience for nearly 15 years working as an environmental attorney and activist is that you need to do a triage of figuring out where your priorities are, where your biggest human health threats are, and likewise where you're going to be able to get bang for your buck in terms of immediate near-term projects, and then what are the things you need to put, not necessarily in the back burner, but to prioritize in terms of figuring out innovative solutions, capital infrastructure funding, or what have you. I would offer moving forward, probably some of the biggest opportunities would be, can you, through your local zoning and your county process, do more than your state may or may not be politically willing or scientifically willing to help you develop? In Southwest Montana, we have an asleep at the switch regulatory agency. We've done an assessment of our surface waters. More than 40% of assessed surface waters within my basin are already polluted and impaired at law for nutrient pollution. And yes, this is the northern part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. These are prevalent problems that are directly linked to both chronic agricultural land use as well as increasingly directly to new development pressure. And we have a pattern and practice of the counties rubber stamping new development reliant on the cheapest way to build. They are using this aphorism of affordable housing to essentially become a race to the bottom for local water quality. So I would offer you need to do some critical thinking as a community about how do you, instead of saying no, 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 say this is how we take responsibility, this is the defensible approach, this is how each sector can be a part of the solution, and you do that based upon defensible science of where your goalposts are, and then what are the roadmaps to get you there for respective criteria, for respective sectors, and what is the blueprint that provides, in turn, each one of those sectors responsibility, a seat at the table, and also regulatory certainty in terms of they're not coming back to the proverbial well and getting whacked as bad actors. They're instead being part of those solutions. So this is my approach and suggestion to you. Develop your criteria for your most sensitive water. That's going to obviously be respective to both groundwater and surface water. Prioritize what you're going to do. Where are your most pressing problems? And I would offer you probably need to start with human health threats and then work yourself on down from there. You need to prioritize what is a near-term versus a long-term endeavor based upon both the prioritization and the human health risks, as well as what are the tools in your tool belt as a matter of federal, state, or county enforcement. And then lastly, I'll leave you with the thought that informed decision-making needs to be based upon three key elements: transparency, accountability, and enforcement. If you lack any one of those three criterion, you are likely to have a flawed decision-making process that will not result in your desired outcome. You cannot simply go forward and say, we have the science, and we hope everybody is going to toe the line and do their part. That does not work. We live in the United States of America. You have to have accountability metrics. You have to have built-in enforceability. And the good news is, you as a community appear to have much more will and solidarity in terms of wanting to develop that programmatic approach. So I would say focus on that accountability and enforcement side and think outside the box. Be creative. You have home rule in Jackson. You have the ability to do innovative partnerships with the county. You have an ability to do once in a lifetime, once in a generation, ARPA-style bonding and infrastructure pass-through funding. This is where you need to be thinking. Where are your priorities, and how can you leverage generational pass-through funding opportunities to work near-term and long-term?
Thank you, Guy. That was a great set of recommendations for this group. But I just wanted to talk about, what the town of Mashpee did once we received our comprehensive plan. Like I said, we did sit on a shelf for a little while. But what we did after the years and when it started to become visibly noticeable is our sewer commission became very much more engaged. I would recommend that the community start an action committee of some sort to hold for accountability and look through the plan and the action items and what can you do now in the short term and what can you do in the long term. There's a ton of things that you can do now without the almighty dollar affecting anything. You can do green infrastructure, LID practices on your own property. There's so much you can do. I don't know what the Board of Health or your planning board or zoning board has the ability to do, but in the town of Mashpee, we did put a moratorium on all new septic systems that were not IA or alternative or innovative systems. That being that they award denitrifying systems or on-site septic treatment facilities, basically. We did that along with different zoning changes, requiring LID and green infrastructure on new special permits that were issued by the town of Mashpee. What we also did as our conservation office, we put in an enhanced wetlands buffer, which means all new development had to meet a higher standard for the buffer zone closer to a wetland resource area. We went from 100 feet to 150 feet, which meant that the development had to have 75 feet of a naturally vegetated buffer. That uptakes nitrogen, that uptakes phosphorus, and all the nutrients of concern. So that's something that we did. That's something you can do now, besides, the financial component. So there's 3 components. You have to get the financial people on the board. You need to get the scientific community on the board and the political party. What is the motive? Where your political stance is? Is it grow, 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 or do they want to do strategic planning? Do we want to look at these areas that we want to protect? That requires land acquisition. That's something that the town of Mashpee did too. Some of the more vulnerable areas that are on your aquifer or close to a water resource area, buy them, keep them, put conservation restrictions on them, and prevent development in those on-site septic systems from being installed. That's something that you can do now. I don't know what the appetite is there, but it is doable. So for your planning process, look at the cluster developments and where you can strategically sewer, where you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck. And that's really what you need to do. And that's what the town of Mashpee did. We went through our plan. We looked at, the clusters. How many homes can we sewer and take offline for the littlest amount of money, where we're going to get the most removal from our estuaries? And you can do the same here. So I, stress that. Look at your plan, analyze it, have the action committee, and follow those actions to the T on a scheduled time frame. Right now, we're on a 20-year time frame. So we're looking at 5 phases. I don't know what your plan is going to recommend through the phasing, but there's financial grants that a nonprofit can even apply for. So as a 501c3, which you are, you can apply for ARPA and USDA funds to get some type of funding for engineering and construction design. Education is huge. Go to your community, show them the plan. This is what is recommended for our area. This is what we need you to buy into. And I can't stress that enough. Maybe do a PSA once the plan is released, just to inform the public that this is what we have, this is the goal, this is where we're moving, we're gonna need your input, we need your presence, rally together. That's what works. So recently in Mashpee, we had a unanimous vote, and it was only because of public engagement and communications for our phase 1 implementation, which was $72 million that passed without one person saying no. That's for clean water. You're gonna get that, but it does take community buy-in. So rally and educate, it's huge. It's so important for all of these projects moving forward. So my recommendations are start a committee, hold them accountable, your county commissioners and the people who are in charge, and just get out there and spread the word for clean water.
I'm not sure I'm going to say anything all that different. I'll just say it in different words. Maybe it'll sink in different ways. But in 1904, the Texas Supreme Court was taking a look at groundwater and potential for groundwater regulation. And the court, in what is now an iconic ruling, said that groundwater, quote, was too secret, occult, and concealed to be able to be understood. And so there was no regulatory action taken. And today, we can no longer pretend that natural processes and the future is unknowable to secret or concealed or occult. We know what's going on. But we don't know some key data points relating to septic systems. In a lot of cases, communities don't know the number that are installed, where they are, their condition. So top of the list is to be able to understand those processes, to be able to identify where the biggest problems are. And some states are doing inventories, and if not doing inventories, then are taking a look at factors that would be surrogates for septic system problems. Places that sewers don't reach, that are rural, perhaps low income, and using that to identify where hotspots might be. So understanding the problem is a first step in any circumstance, particularly for septic. So where they are, how many there are, what condition they're in. Another is to assess your pressure points, where action might take place. So do agencies have existing authority that can be used? In some cases, do they need new authorities? That was the case in Las Vegas this year, which slightly different circumstances, but there was a debate in Nevada about requiring septic system owners in the Las Vegas area to connect to sewer. And the reasoning there was that septic systems it's a loss of water from the system, because Las Vegas, when the water goes to the central treatment plant, they put it upstream of Lake Mead and then use that as a circular water system. So they can treat the water, put it back in the lake, pull it out, treat it again, so it's not a loss of water downstream. So they wanted to require septic system owners to connect to sewer to preserve their water supply. That required an act of the legislature, so that was included in a House bill in Nevada. The big sticking point there was the requirement, the mandatory and unfunded requirement for homeowners to connect to septic. And this is a big sticking point anywhere across the country where you're looking at septic conversions, is the question of who pays. That bill had to be amended for it to go through, and mandatory conversions now became voluntary conversions, and voluntary fully paid for by a pot of government funds. And so that I got an email. People find my septic system series in the most unlikely of ways. And I got an email from a concerned resident in Las Vegas who found my septic system series. And she said, we're having this big debate in the legislature, and we think it's unjust, and we want you to tell us how to convince them not to tell us to convert from septic to sewer. I said, well, I can't do that. But I can tell you that funding is the big sticking point in these cases, and that was the case there. So it went from mandatory to voluntary, and required funding to do that. And I think we'll get to the funding question here in a bit. But that's one thing to look at. Another is, as Guy said, is this a matter for the courts? Is there legal action that needs to be taken place, not just for septic systems, but for wastewater flows in general? Is there a big point source that is not doing what it needs to do under its NIPD's permits or other permitting? And then the biggest question, where the money will come from. Yeah.
Thank you. So the federal government, about 2 years ago, announced the infrastructure bill, and we are now 2 years into a 5-year window to access these funds. It is the largest investment in water and wastewater infrastructure. And so the question is, how have you used any of this funding, and how have you used it?
Yes, Southwest Montana is actively throughout at the county level, at the municipal level, and at the different sectors level, actively using ARPA funds. To back up, I want to put a little bit of context here, and probably my journalism compatriot can do a better job, but we have not seen infrastructure opportunities in terms of investments in the United States in almost 80 years. My understanding is after World War II, during the Eisenhower era, the era of building our transportation networks, which of course was about defense, but this is when we also did our critical infrastructure investments, right? You had your pools, you had your community venues. This is when the last time the federal government opened up the proverbial coffer. I'm stressing this point to say we are foolish to not try to put a good faith estimate and to avail ourselves of experts such as hopefully Jill later today that can help you fashion how do we identify the opportunity. How do we put together a coherent science-based proposal identifying both the issue and what our needs are? And then how do we make sure that we're building partnerships to realize those funding opportunities? I think you in POW-JH and the Valley here is in a unique circumstance in that your problem is at a smaller geographic scale than many others are looking at. So you have a unique opportunity in terms of geography is destiny, right? It's always about the location, baby. The unique part of that is you can focus in a prioritization process and identify those key places that you can get bang for your buck in terms of major infrastructure. One of the things that we have been pressing as an organization throughout, I work in a 7-county area, so not just one. We've been really focused on fighting both decentralized community-based septic systems, and likewise beating the proverbial whack-a-mole at the county fair in terms of mega new subdivisions with high density, cloaked in the vestige of affordable housing, and yet they're all reliant on exempt wells and on individual septic systems, and we do not have rules at the county or the state level to ever maintain, enforce, or do anything. And those levels of treatment, like you have in your valley, are not they're not adequate to protect your down gradient surface water, to protect your drinking water supplies, or to protect your neighbors from illegal trespass. So we are really focusing programmatically on saying to the vast majority of county governments, much to their chagrin, you need to focus on regional scale wastewater projects. You need to make visionary generational investments. And it doesn't matter that you don't have the details of exactly how this will work out. You need to use your science to identify the pressing human health and aquatic life, et cetera, needs, again, based upon your criteria that you've developed of what's necessary to protect your surface water, your groundwater resources, to show where the funding gaps are, and then to put forward concrete proposals saying we want to invest in preliminary engineering reports or retaining the experts to flesh out what this regional system looks like. And remember, too, you have authorities under federal law everywhere you start to have density and categorical scales of development, whether residential, commercial, institutional land uses, you have tools in your tool belt under federal law to also work on mandating low impact development. And let's not forget that stormwater flow is a significant proportional contributor of your water quality woes, particularly for surface water and for alluvial aquifers that are unconfined, also a huge contaminant source. And so far, not many people are focusing on the mandated LID for all new growth and redevelopment. So I would offer focus on both of those.
Great. So the town of Mashpee has tapped into some of the infrastructure bill funds. So the state of Massachusetts set up a Clean Water State Revolving Fund where communities on the Cape and the region can apply for those funds and receive subsidies through our county. The town of Mashpee received roughly $1 million in ARPA funds to start the construction and design phase of phase 1, which was the building of our wastewater treatment facility. We've also applied for state revolving funds and so far received $66 million through that source of funding. We just recently voted unanimously at our select board meeting to go for another $100 million to the SRF funds opportunity. We will be applying for more ARPA funds as a region. Cape Cod did receive $64 million through ARPA funds, which will be released in increments. So each municipality can go to the county and request additional funding for either engineering, permit designs for wastewater. And I did want to touch on some of the stormwater grants that the town has received. We do have an indigenous community, but I stress you go through the Federal Clean Water 319. Section 319 covers non-point source pollution, and you can apply for grants through that source as a nonprofit or a government agency. We've also received, through 319, which is 604B funds for stormwater. And redesign and green infrastructure. So far, we've put in place a series of stormwater different practices as far as rain gardens, bioswales, bioretention areas, abutting a pond that is severely polluted with phosphorus, and that was done solely through grant funding. So stormwater is a huge component, like Guy said, and I would stress that nonprofits in your county apply for those funds because they are available. Another source of funding that I did want to bring up is the NOAA grant funds that were recently put aside through this big funding source that we've never seen and we probably will never see ever again. But if you have any, wetland areas that you'd like to restore, they're a nutrient sink. They really absorb a lot of the nitrogen and phosphorus getting into your waterways. If you have any impaired systems that you're looking to get restored, I stress you apply for NOAA grant funds because you're never going to see these funds again. It's a 5-year plan through NOAA and the Coastal Zone Management, which you probably don't apply for here, but you can apply for those funds for wetland restoration as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, this is historic opportunity right now for infrastructure investment from the federal level. There was the big construction grants program after the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 that provided upgrades to many of the nation's wastewater treatment systems. That transitioned in '87 to what we have now as the state revolving funds, which are the big federal intervention into infrastructure funding. And the way that works is Congress each year puts some money to the states. The states have a 20% match, and then they loan that money out to projects. The money that gets repaid along with the interest goes back into the loan fund to be loaned out again. So the revolving fund, it revolves, money out, money in, and the money grows over time with the addition of funds from Congress. With the infrastructure bill that was passed recently, there's more money now in these next 5 years than there has been really in any time since the revolving funds were started for infrastructure improvements. So this is the time to really take advantage of those funds. And there's a lot of steps to the SRF and how you get funding, but one of those is the state puts out an intended use plan. So these are projects that could apply for funding. And I took a look at Wyoming's last night out of curiosity, and there are 3 Jackson area projects on the IUP, the intended use plan. One was the upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant, another was something near the airport, and I can't remember what the third was. There were also septic conversions in Wilson and septic conversions in Hoback on the intended use plan. So these have been identified by the state as potential projects for funding. And it's a matter of those communities actually applying for the grants. So again, those ideas are out there, and potential for funding is there. Another consideration now with the SRFs is that earmarks are back in Congress. And if you have friends in high places, get some congressionally directed spending and get your project inserted into a budget bill. But be warned, though, that has caused a lot of concern among utilities because those earmarks, the funding for those earmarks is being taken out of the money for the SRFs. So the concern is that more earmarks means less money going to states for the states to decide how to spend. And the utilities and utility groups are worried that this threatens the long-term viability of the revolving funds with more earmarks. So that's the tension right now at the federal level, is having a large amount of money available for the first time in many generations for infrastructure, but also having earmarks cut into that funding availability. And then some other ways of funding that other communities have done are local taxes. We had the local tax here for water infrastructure. Atlanta's used a local sales tax, I think it's 1/8% to fund hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure improvements for water and sewer. So that is another source of funds.
Thank you. So we're now going to open it up for questions. So if anybody has some questions, let me know. Kay?
Thank you. This is really. Is it? I can't hear myself from far away. Okay. A question I have. A couple of chemical engineers, myself, finance people, sat down, looked at the scoping costs that we have for the wastewater treatment plant and what residents are currently charged for their water and sewer, which is combined, and it's mainly sewer. So one thing, is that one? Oh, gosh. Okay. So I guess I'd say a couple of chemical engineers that are used to doing capital projects and finance people, we went through the city's accounting, how much they're charging people and businesses in the county. And we looked at the scoping costs. Tri-Hydro did some scoping costs for if we're going to put in a bioreactor or mechanical treatment plant, trying to understand the impact. Right now we don't have the funding, certainly hoping to do that. So if what I would say moderate person in the county is paying $250 a year for their sewer. I know, we're low. I mean, the estimate is that it's and it should not really be quoted as fact, it's probably going to approach $500, $600. That really excited some people when I talked to them. And I also think when it comes to businesses like restaurants, hotels, which have huge water bills, theirs are probably going to be doubled. So we haven't talked about the absolute, response. You can get all this infrastructure, it's not going to come for free. So I was wondering if you could explain what you've seen happening in your communities when the bill is coming through. And certainly, and when I say, a moderate person, I'm talking about someone who has a modest home and maybe just a couple of bedrooms. And, so for them, the working class, that extra $300 a year seems to really excite them. But I think the businesses here, it's going to be a real eye-opener if they have $2,000 a year, $5,000 a year bill for water, and it becomes $10,000. And that conversation really hasn't progressed. So I'm hoping you can address that.
Water and economic costs are so subjective, and we're just chuckling, and I think we're chuckling about the same thing, which is we're already on that other end of, I would kill to have a $250 a month bill. And let me back up. The way in which my nonprofit has approached this context, and again, I work at a basin scale. We're a fifth of the land mass of the state of Montana, and I work throughout that 7-county area. And we're doing this at very much so the basin approach of saying the state needs to step up and provide either low-cost funds or otherwise to help both municipalities, as well as do this prioritization process you've already heard me opine on. Within that, municipalities, if you do polling in Montana, which we have done, the vast majority of residents, and when I say that, I say over 77%, as polled by our organization and Montana Conservation Voters, universally support upgrading and increased bills that protect discrete things that they give a damn about. Turning on their faucet and having safe drinking water, being able to recreate and having keynote blue ribbon trout streams. Those things, our water, our wildlife, our Western heritage, polls really well. So for when I think about this idea of the costs will in some way, shape, or form increase for you, double, triple, or otherwise, and some sectors even more so, I frankly am not too empathetic because what I think about is this is a messaging battle as opposed to a pragmatic concern. That what we need to talk about is what is the value of Jackson Hole writ large in this valley of not having a safe drinking water supply? What is the economic benefit that you see through your tourism, and who knows how many tens of millions come through this valley annually, and what is the cost that you are disproportionately shouldering and have legacy pollution from right now that you have to concern yourself with? We need to think about innovative ways to do PR to message that this is not about us versus you or a single individual having to double their potential septic bill, what have you. What we need to be messaging instead is this is a way in which we as a community can invest in the solutions that will provide sustainable defense of the things we all value the most in the future. And that the way you get at that is not to dismiss somebody's legitimate concern. If they've had $250 annual bill for 10 years, I would offer, well, why don't we as a community come up with a revolving loan fund, or again, ways in which you can help incentivize people to slowly shoulder that burden. And for the business sector, the way in which my nonprofit has approached it is we very much partner with different entities and help them understand how this provides them regulatory certainty in terms of you make this investment and you become a willing partner in this, and look at the benefits for you in terms of clear expectations of what you're doing, your profit margins, your ROI for the next decade, 2 decades, et cetera, that you've invested and been a part of the solution as opposed to saying no, no, no. We have turned many of our most fervent detractors into some of our best allies, and that includes the Montana League of Cities and Towns, which is one of the most conservative lobbying institutions in the Northern Rockies. So I think that there's grand opportunity to flip the script and to qualify and quantify what does this talk about, and to use traditional PR strategies, in particular focusing on how do you qualify and quantify the benefit of a healthy Jackson Hole in your valley, and how do you qualify and quantify the economic impact of keeping it clean as opposed to fighting for Mashpee scale pollution down the line. That's an economic exercise, and I believe that would be a compelling statistic that you could really use to your benefit in public conversations and messaging moving forward. Go.
Right.
Yeah, and we want to get to a bunch of questions, so let's keep these short.
Okay.
2 minutes.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, you're fine. I just want to talk a little bit about our bill. You know, $250, that's really nothing in retrospect. They will pay. They will pay for clean water. The residents, they will. It's a no-brainer. If you want to swim in your estuaries in the homes that you live in, what the town of Mashpee did is we did some taxing offset through short-term rental taxes. So we have a lot of second homes, and those people are renting their second homes weeks at a time. So we're charging a 2.75% surcharge on those short-term rentals. We also have what's called our wastewater infrastructure fund, which is, you know, we switched percentages around. We have a community preservation fund in the state of Massachusetts, and we took percentage from that community preservation fund and moved it to our wastewater infrastructure fund. So it's an offset for the taxpayer. What we also did is a residential tax exemption for full-time residents. So full-time residents that qualified were under the median income range of less than 120% qualified for that residential tax exemption, which it's a decrease on your taxes, basically.
Your stormwater utility?
Stormwater utility?
Sorry.
No.
Another question.
So we do have water. It's a district, so the community members do pay for their water, and we're planning on doing the same for wastewater, is paying a district or a separate entity for wastewater treatment. We forecasted it's going to be about $1,000 per resident per year on their taxes to pay for the entirety of our phasing.
Okay, next. Back there. Is that Tom? Oh, hold on. If we can get you the microphone, that'd be great.
Other side of the tent.
Perhaps I missed it, but did anyone mention the use of municipal bonds? You know, I can't imagine that Teton County, Wyoming can't float an enormous amount of municipal debt.
I'll let Town of Mashpee speak to the municipal bonds. I know that in Montana, most municipalities have used municipal bonds to do major infrastructure projects. At present, the irony is that based upon impact litigation from about 15 years ago, the major municipalities in Montana have already had to do upgrades to essentially membrane bioreactors. It might be called ENR technology here. I don't know what your term of art is. Essentially, they got their nutrients down to something shy of reverse osmosis. And that's important because in the context of when we talk about, you know, what are your site-specific criteria that protect the things you give a damn about, that gets you 90% of the way there. And then it becomes a law of diminishing returns to do technological investment. Beyond that, then it's bang for your buck about how do you deal with the septics, how do you deal with diffuse non-point, how do you deal with your mandated low-impact development. All that to say, municipal bonds, I think, are totally an opportunity, and I would offer that some initial conversations and research about Jackson's home rule and your ability to do things that the legislature can't thwart you in. That's some interesting opportunities for you to think about regional partnerships and then using your bonding capabilities to pay for some of this up front in conjunction with potentially ARPA grants or other pass-through funding.
So the town of Mashpee hasn't had to use bonding yet. We're planning on using bonding in our second phase. So we did pay for our first phase one way, but we're going to have to go into bonding for the additional fees, which is second phase is $100 million. So there's no way to do it but bonding.
And I will say on the bonding question and question of payment, I look at how people vote. And when bond measures are put to voters for water and sewer infrastructure, they almost always pass at state and local level. Like the pass rate is 90% or so. So when people have the choice, and they do vote for clean water.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, Paul Hansen with the Jackson Hole News and Guide. My question's maybe for Megan. Brad said we've been talking about this issue since 1978, but we don't have much to show for it yet. I know you guys are working very hard to change that. Given what we've heard from these other experiences, what's our strategy here in Jackson Hole to begin to get some real measurable progress?
All right. Well, I mean, we have started some. One of the big things that, well, obviously the $10 million water quality spec measure was a significant thing for everyone. But another thing in the beginning of this year was the county deciding that they would own infrastructure, and that's a big step. So once the county starts owning infrastructure, as far as critical infrastructure for sewer, then they also, are part of the game, and they need to talk a little bit more with the town. So moving forward with that has been significant. As far as Hoback, obviously that is where there's drinking water that has been an issue. And again, we lobbied to the state, and again, a different amount of money, but a $10 million. They were at, I would say, a priority of 200 when they first were on. And then once we lobbied the state, they are now at number 13 on the list on what Brett was referring to as the intended use plan. So we are making headway. Why we want to have this conversation is because these infrastructure funds are available. And that's what we're not doing right now. So the point of this meeting is to really discuss how can we accelerate this? How can we say there are funds out there, we need to look at those funds, access those funds, and move forward. As far as the Water Quality Master Plan, there are going to be zones in which they're going to prioritize which areas should be sewered. So those would be the next steps, and that's what we're anticipating from the Water Quality Master Plan and recommendations from Tri-Hydro.
As a follow-up, as you know, we've talked a lot about having existing septics inspected and cleaned on a regular basis. It's recommended by EPA. It's done in a lot of other places. It came to a vote before the county commission. Luther and Mark voted for it. Natalia, Greg Epstein, and Mark Barron voted against it. What's our strategy? I mean, this is a pretty straightforward, simple, inexpensive step. What's our strategy to be able to do that? Similarly, we mow right down to the waterway throughout town. Our own Parks and Rec department mows right down to the waterway in the parks in town. This is a no-brainer. It doesn't cost you anything to do. And so what's our strategy to kind of tick off some of these? I know you're doing a lot of meetings and a lot of hard work, but
Right.
is there a strategy you can share with us?
Again, we are looking at the Tri-Hydro recommendations, and out of that, we've been going through this for about a year and a half, and their recommendations are going to be an inspection and maintenance program, and moving forward, they are going to have areas like for ponds and land development regulations as well in order to have certain setbacks. So part of that is coming out of this Water Quality Master Plan. Again, in June, we lobbied the county commission to hire a water quality specialist. They are in the process of that. We want this water quality specialist to begin and launch this water quality master plan in January. So again, for it not to sit on the shelf. So again, moving forward, that's what we're looking to do. We're bringing in these folks in order for people to have even a bigger vision of what should happen.
An analogous situation is that many of the different approaches that we're taking in Southwest Montana is advocating that individual counties update their ordinances in terms of prospective new development. That's your low-hanging fruit. How do you at least control and mitigate the impacts of a system that is technically designed and not capable of providing the pollution control for the geology and geography that you have? It's undisputed. So what we're advocating is take that system off the table and simply raise the bar in terms of what new development has to do. That should be something that's pragmatic, but also tangible for the average decision maker, and that's what we're trying to do in Montana as but one step in a series of steps, again, based upon prioritization and what can you do that doesn't cost you new money.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you to Powell JH for putting this on, and thank you to the panelists for coming here. My question is, why do governments have a hard time with this? And you all have had experiences in one way or another with local, state governments. And 50 years ago, I had an experience where a lake was severely polluted from septic systems. Sewers were put in. This was the 1970s, and the lake cleaned up. And it just seems like it's not that complicated. So why do governments struggle, in your opinions?
Well, let's start with the law, then we'll get to pragmatism increasingly here. When the Federal Clean Water Act was passed, as many of you may or may not know, we had rivers on fire, and we focused through a systematic approach on our biggest industrial polluters, right? It was about a one-way ratchet. We were focusing on the issues that were per se degrading waters such to the extent that they were on fire and you had no life in the river. We did that very mindfully in the 70s, focusing on that without an understanding comprehensively that there were seemingly benign but other ways in which we are degrading our water. The state of science has progressed significantly since the 1960s and 1970s, such that the law, the federal law, which is where most state constitutions and most state regulatory programs start as their baseline, few go above it, but that baseline never contemplated this idea of septic-based pollution or tried to control, conversely, the agricultural inputs. Those were all considered non-point source. So at the most basic level, we have a federal paradigm at which most states have taken in some way, shape, or form as their baseline, and it never contemplated these type of somewhat esoteric concepts. And because we don't have specific authority to work on them, no one has really picked up the ball until there are crises. And that's where we're at, and I hope that's what you take away, is that each of us in our different reflective roles, we are all essentially all at that precipice where we are seeing the ecological impacts of, we've dealt with the industrial polluters, we have dealt with the hugest commercial sectors, but now we're at the stuff where it really does matter what happens in your backyard and what happens at the community scale, and we need to develop state-based solutions.
So I just want to go from a small town municipality, it's very much our elected officials, it's a popularity contest, okay? Let's put it bluntly. And when you are living in a tourism industry, they don't want to point saying, oh, we're dirty. We want people to come to us. We want to have the tourism industry to fuel our economy, and there's some municipalities, I don't want to say who, but they are abutters. They don't want to admit there's a problem. They don't want to admit. They want people to keep coming. They don't want to raise taxes. And that's been the appetite for a number of years on the Cape, is they turned a blind eye. They didn't want to recognize the problem. Well, it became visible, and we were sued by the Conservation Law Foundation, and they had to act. That's what happened in my municipality, at least. And the elected officials want to keep their seats. They want to remain popular. They want to get the votes. They don't want to see the property taxes rise. They want to see more people coming into town and building. So that's...
So no tools in your tool belt, and you want to be liked and not have a conversation that sucks at the grocery mart.
Right.
Lisa?
In my experience, people only act when they have to. And you only act once you're forced to, and that's when things become visible in a crisis. You don't get points for the disaster that didn't happen. And it's very hard to be proactive and point to that as a success. Only when you have very clear counterexamples, like hurricane in Florida recently, shut down power grid, except for this new development, Babcock Ranch, that had its own solar grid, and they had power throughout the hurricane. And they're very wise now, looking back 10 years when they put that investment in. But it takes counterexamples like that, the disasters that didn't happen, to spur some action on the front end, being proactive.
As a quick follow-up, I'd also offer that we in the Northern Rockies have a unique opportunity in terms of the messaging battle that is inherent in all conservation issues. That we are the headwaters of one of the largest river systems in the lower 48, right? That you have the opportunity to remind people of it is so much cheaper and more efficient to get ahead of the curve than it is to pay to fix it down the line. And keeping a message simple and sweet, we're making miles of traction with that in Montana, and I'd offer you could do so here as well.
Lisa?
Hi. Do you have any examples of real estate transfer taxes or fees helping water projects? Can you cite any that you're aware of?
I'm not sure about real estate transfer. I'm familiar with, as a matter of, most of the municipalities in Bozeman that have stormwater have addressed it through stormwater utilities that are essentially incentivizing different land use based upon qualifying how much impervious surface is on your residential lot, and then you have incentives as a matter of the tax code to do either retrofits and or BMPs. So that's really my main knowledge in terms of the tax code incentives, is incentivizing good behavior in terms of private partnerships with larger sectors of land use.
Yeah, there are examples, and when I talked about the toolbox and need to look at existing authorities and potential to need to add new authorities for agencies. There are states and municipalities that do require, upon sale of home, an inspection of the septic system to see if it's still working. So that's the case in Michigan and New Jersey and other places. Also for water well testing, when the home is sold, you need to test the well water to see what's in there. So those do exist. And then there are local regulations for, new development and for, major renovation of existing development that new denitrifying septic systems have to be put in place.
And I can speak on Massachusetts. We do that same inspection in Massachusetts for the transfer of homes. You do need to inspect your septic systems. But now with the new DEP regulations that came out, our now Title V standard is a denitrifying system. So if your septic system has failed, you need to put in a denitrifying system. And there is some offset to those costs in 0% loans that are offered to residents that qualify. So if you're in a certain class of median income, you do qualify for certain 0% interest loans. And so you're able to do those, retrofits on your property. And we do incentivize, green infrastructure and LID practices on your home. And that's really just through community outreach and education. And, we have nonprofit groups that have started, and they're really pushing that forward. And the gentleman that spoke on the lawns right down to the waterway, I hate to say it, but neighbor shaming really works. And I mean, we've seen it in our community, and we're not going out there pointing out the residents with the green lawn right to the ponds, but other residents are, and they're going to their properties and saying, hey, that's a bad idea. So, something you can do.
Okay, one last question. Anyone? No? Okay. All right, so we're going to switch out. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.